So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third presentation of the year. I'm Brent Taylor, convener of the Speaker Program for Military History and Heritage Victoria. And on behalf of our committee, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. Speaker tonight's Peter Mitchell, and speaking about I'll Walk Beside You, Love, Loss, and the Burma Railway and the Human Spirit. A little bit about Peter. Peter's an author of Under the Same Moon, a book that he showcased last year. He is a lawyer by training and was a partner in the major law firm. After leaving the law, he ran a regional non-profit organisation for many years based in Singapore. History is his passion. He has an extensive library and brackets music collection and has read widely on the Second World War and other periods of history after growing up listening to his father and his friends regularly talk about their own wartime experiences. He lived in Singapore for 20 years and has travelled and worked extensively throughout Asia, visiting most of the locations written about in I Will Walk Beside You. A little bit of process before Peter begins. He'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. You can ask your questions in one of two ways. You can post a chat message anytime up to and including question time and address the question to everybody. When that time comes, I'll read your question using whatever name appears on your computer identity. Or you can wait and put your hand up during question time and I'll invite you to ask your question verbally. And there's not too many of you today, so we'll probably do more of that than the former. Peter's happy for cameras to be on, but remember everyone can also see you. Please make sure your microphones are switched off, and by now you should be on speaker view. I now invite Peter to speak. There you go, Peter. Over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Brent, and good evening, everyone. I'll just share my screen and see if this works. How's that? Okay. Can you hear me, everyone? Okay. So thanks very much again, Brent, and thanks to MHHV for giving the opportunity to talk about the book tonight. Briefly, just what it's about before we hop into some of the detail. It follows on, as Brent mentioned, from Under the Same Moon. It's a sequel to that book. It's essentially about two brothers, Cal and Alan, who appear here on the cover, and their friends from school days, from their neighbourhood, from their time in the Melbourne University Rifles that they joined in 1932, all of whom enlisted at around the same time, and all of whom find themselves in the same company of the same battalion, newly formed in Melbourne in June 1940. I think that the expression "band of brothers" is very sort of overused and hackneyed, but surely it must be appropriately applied to this group of young men and boys. We open where under the same moon left off with uh, about 3,000 Australian troops on board a transport ship, the HMT Orchides, which has sailed way ahead of the rest of the convoys of ships coming out from the Middle East and ultimately returning to Australia and not to Burma. But we've at the end of Under the Same Moon, a woeful decision has been made by, or a sort of a handball decision has been made by the Australian government and General Wavell to leave the men in Java rather than pull the ship back to the rest of the convoy, and that the ship was subject to the same order to return to Australia. The men fight a battle in Java. They're taken prisoner, moved to Singapore, and then on to Burma, to the Burma end of the railway. The book is all about their families at home who have no contact for 3.5 years, and life in Australia at the time, depicted principally through letters. The sources are many and varied. It's all fact. The book is based on hundreds of letters written between 1935 and 1945 between Cal and his wife, also letters that his brother Alan wrote, and letters from Carl's father and other members of the family. Late in life, Carl recorded about 15 hours of his life, largely the war years, on cassette tape, which I had access to. He wrote memoirs that are unpublished that I also had access to, and also the memoirs of some of his friends that I was given access to. There were also a number of books which I regard as primary sources as well. The battalion history, the Second Pioneer Battalion. One of Carl's friends uh, kept a diary, which he managed to keep away from the Japanese during the war. And that diary formed the basis of a book which he published in the 1990s. Another friend wrote a book which was published shortly after the end of the war. There's yet another book which contains a number of extracts from the diary of the secret diary, again, of the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Williams. More about him later, and of course the Australian official histories. So that's the book in outline. I Where we left the troops, as I said just earlier, was hopefully this works. There we go. Um, on the Orchids at Tanjong Priok, the port of Batavia. A decision has been made that the men are to stay there and go ashore and support the Dutch. That reason was based purely on the grounds of uh, not wanting to upset the Dutch and for reasons of British prestige. So around the 18th of February, while the Australian War Cabinet is making a decision not to make a decision, the men are sitting here on the ship, and all through the day, decisions are being made and reversed as to whether or not they disembark. In the end, they do disembark, and my little thing's not working. And here they are on the docks at Tanjong Priok, and I thought you might be interested. This is some photos taken by the Allied Geographical Service, the intelligence unit that was based, I think, in Queensland, and quite a big report was prepared on the West Bantam area of West Java, and these are some of the photographs that appear in that report. So this is the Tanjong Priok harbour with the road to Batavia to the north. This is the road from Tanjong Priok harbour to Batavia immediately pre-war, and some photographs of Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, of course. This is the Hotel des Indes, which was a favourite of the Japanese officers. Another photograph of downtown Batavia, and this one going way up into the distance, we'll see Mr. Cornelis. That was where the prisoners, the Australian prisoners, were offloaded and marched to their first prison camp, the bicycle camp, which I'll get onto shortly. Colonel Williams had a camera which he managed to keep away from the Japanese all through, and this is one of his photographs of Batavia while they were there. I first want to talk about a battle, uh, the Battle of Lawiliang, and I thought I'd just open up by reading something that Joan Beaumont wrote for the official launch of this book, I'll Walk Beside You, last month at the Royal Historical Society, the Battle of Lawiliang. And I wanted to talk about this because it's fascinating. I think it's a great Australian military story. No one knows about it. And this is what Joan said in her speech at the launch. The first part of this book deals with the fighting that followed, most notably the Battle of Lawiliang. Most of us might say the Battle of Ware. Because national memory is a very selective process, giving prominence to some episodes of the past over others Today we hear a lot about Prime Minister John Curtin's refusal in early 1942 to allow Australian troops returning from the Middle East to be diverted, as Churchill wanted, to Burma. But we hear far less about Curtin's decision to allow some Australian troops to be diverted to Java to support the Dutch troops' hopeless task of defending the Dutch colonial possessions, the Netherlands East Indies. The decision to support the Dutch, made in early 1941 and not really reviewed thereafter, was a largely political one. The forces on Java had no chance of success given the Japanese dominance of air and sea after the sinking of the British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse only days after Pearl Harbor. The decision to send Australians to Java, then like the deployment of unequipped and unsupported Australian battalions on Ambon and Dutch Timor, was a woeful one that I think can only be explained as the dominance of emotion over reason and a lingering and misplaced faith in European imperial power. As Peter says, the Battle of Luiliang was not properly recognised at the time, and it continues to be forgotten, not least, I think, because there remains some unease at the official levels about the decisions of 1942 and the lasting sense of betrayal that the troops felt at being placed not only by the British commander Wavell, but Curtin also, in such a hopeless situation. But while the Williang has been forgotten, it was, as Peter shows, a battle in which Australians displayed remarkable fortitude, perseverance, courage, and resilience. This is a map of Western Java, Dutch names prevailing. So the Australian troops are ordered to disembark from the troop ship Orchides. What were the forces? Just before flying back to Australia, General Laverack promoted Arthur Blackburn to the rank of brigadier to command all AIF forces on Java. There were over 2,900 troops that disembarked from the Orchides. The two main units were over 900 men of the 2nd Pioneer Battalion and over 700 of the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, Blackburn's old battalion, and Weary Dunlop's casualty clearing station. The rest, almost half, were non-combatants, so drivers, engineers, guards battalion members, and so on. In Batavia, on top of the men on the ship, were 175 what were called Singapore stragglers. These were men who, for some mysterious reason that they would not own up to, managed to get out of Singapore and found themselves in Batavia, lying around in the wharf area. They wouldn't say how they got there, and there was quite a deal of suspicion about what were they doing there and not in Singapore. In addition, there were 100 reinforcements that had come in from Fremantle en route to Singapore, but because of the fall of Singapore a few days earlier, there they remained. As to the forces on the ground, there were very few fighters, and the Dutch planes, what there were of them, were greatly inferior to the Japanese, and the pilots had little training. Most of the Allied land forces on Java were Dutch, about 25,000, but they were largely local, poorly trained, and of questionable loyalty. General Sturdy, the Chief of General Staff, sent an appreciation to the War Cabinet earlier in the month, and he was quite savage in his assessment of the Dutch forces. He described them as being little better than Home Guard. They were completely immobile, had very poor communication systems. The Japanese were even more brutal in their assessment. In 1940, before they entered the war, they had sent a delegation ostensibly on a peaceful diplomatic mission, but their actual objective was to assess the defences of Java and report back to Tokyo. And essentially, what they said was that the Dutch defences were hopeless, and they would be able to roll the place over in a couple of days, and they were pretty much right. There was also a Dutch Home Guard of about 40,000, but they had very little training and no tactical knowledge. There was a a battalion of obsolete British tanks, a battalion of US field artillery who had come in from Australia, apparently the first US troops ever to set foot on Australia, and some British anti-aircraft regiments, but largely without guns. So out of all of that, the only effective mobile striking units on the island were the Pioneer Battalion and the Machine Gun Battalion. However, the ships that had come out from the Middle East were not tactically loaded, and so essentially the kit of both of those battalions was on other ships on their way to Australia. So the Pioneer Battalion had a few rifles, not enough to go around, and about 10 rounds of ammunition for each. And the Machine Gun Battalion had no machine guns. However, the Tanjong Priok wharves were full of crates of equipment that had been destined for Singapore. The Australians were given priority for the distribution of this material, and so they were able to sort of load up with Bren's Thompson machine guns, anti-tank rifles, armored cars, Bren carriers, scout cars, and so on, and trucks. But unfortunately, a lot of the trucks were not of a kind that they were used to, and many parts were missing, either because they were on other ships or had gone missing. And there was no field ambulance because Dunlop's casualty clearing station had been sent off to Bandung, which, as you'll see, is way further towards the centre of Java, and at that stage it was the Dutch colonial capital. Major General Allen, before he left Java, had ordered Blackburn on disembarkation to split his force up into five to defend airfields, notwithstanding the fact that there pretty much no planes around. And so what was the point? And Blackburn was quite upset about this because that meant that his already small force was going to be split into five and he'd be unable to train them. And he was very keen that they should be organised to having a fighting role because battle obviously was inevitable. Wavell agreed with him that they need to be a fighting force and that they were the only troops on Java equipped and trained to fight, which is quite astonishing because Wavell was the guy who was instrumental in having them disembark. So, Wavell knew that it was a lost cause. On the 25th of February, the Abda command of Wavell's was disbanded. He flew out, and the Allied troops were put under the command of the Dutch general ter Putten. There was another British general there, Sitwell, who had been Wavell's anti-aircraft advisor. He was given command of all the British and Australian troops and reported to ter Putten. Sitwell was told by Wavell to resist as long as the Dutch did, and when the Dutch gave up, to try and evacuate, but don't expect any help from outside. Sitwell was in heated agreement with Blackburn that it was necessary for the Dutch and British to be combined into a single mobile offensive force. And they had very little time to do this because invasion was imminent, with the Japanese already having taken Sumatra. Insofar as the Dutch were concerned, they knew that they didn't have the forces to prevent a landing in West Java. All they could do would be to offer temporary delaying resistance, falling back to prepared positions, blowing up bridges along the way, and eventually falling back to Bandung, their capital, where they'd make a final stand. The first line of serious resistance in the Dutch plan was to be at Lewiliang, where they would dig in. And you can see Lewiliang, I don't know if my cursor is working, but there's Lewiliang. And Lewiliang was important because it protected the main road. This is probably the best road in Java at the time, and with any attack coming in from this south road here, which we're going to do in a moment, Lewiliang defending it was essential to protect this route from Batavia through to Bandung via Buitenzorg, current day Bogor. Luiliang sat on a river, the Tianjin, and the bridge had been packed with explosives. Putin agreed with Blackburn and Sitwell that the Australian troops, supported by the British squadron of obsolete tanks, should be formed into a mobile striking force, and it was called Black Force. Blackburn uh, formed a brigade of three infantry battalions. The first was largely his machine gun battalion, plus some of the stragglers and the reinforcements. The second was largely the second Pioneer Battalion, and the third were the remnants of those two battalions, plus the non-combatants and the remainder of the stragglers and the reinforcement draft. As I say, he was also given the tanks and also the American Field Artillery Battalion. Blackburn was told to take orders from the Dutch General Schilling, who was the commander in the West Java sector with his headquarters at Batavia. A British colonel had escaped from Malaya and found his way to Java, and he was debriefed by Major General Allen and Brigadier Berryman before they left Java to return to Australia. And he told them how the Japanese how they operated. And this was written up into a pamphlet called Operations in Malaya and became very quickly required reading for every man down to the rank of corporal. What impressed Blackburn in reading Operations in Malaya was the speed of the enemy advance, even in thick jungle. Their general modus operandi was to advance with a central force and fast-moving, wide flanking forces encircling the enemy. So it was obvious to Blackburn that a defensive position against this tactic wouldn't work. That in addition, that in any engagement he wouldn't put all of his forces in one central position. He'd only put part of his forces there, and the rest would be held in reserve for counter encirclement. He then went on a quick reconnoitre of Western Java, and the three main roads I alluded to before are this North Road here through Tangerang to Batavia, and the Great Post Road, this Southern Road coming along here through passing through Jacinga and Luiliang to Buitenzorg, and as I say, the best road on the island from Batavia to Buitenzorg. There are also a number of minor north-south lateral roads from the South Road to the North Road. Blackburn was convinced that the main thrust of the Japanese would be along the South Road. He felt that the North Road was too populous, full of paddy fields and irrigation canals, and it was still the wet season, so it could be very hard for the Japanese to move. So the new Black Force on the 26th of February, they vacated their various airfields and moved to a tea plantation called Champia, which is about a mile, just short of a mile to the east of Luiliang. As I say, Black Force is to be a striking force, taking the fight to the Japanese wherever possible. And if the Japanese moved along the southern road, the plan was that they'd cross the Still River Bridge at Luiliang and thrust west. If the Japanese moved along the northern road, they'd move up the north-south lateral roads from the southern road. This overall plan was stymied very quickly because of the weakness of the Dutch. The Japanese had landed, although no one knew, for a time. On the 1st of March, the Japanese landed at the northwest around Serang here, and they cut off the coastal road linking Batavia and Bandung, the Dutch headquarters. So the only way to get to Bandung now was along the southern road. So the Dutch pulled back rather than going through with their plan to delay as much as possible and blow up bridges along the way. Essentially, they just cleared off, and they just flew all the way back to this pretty much this line here. And in particular, they gave up this without the Japanese being anywhere in sight. A major force of the Dutch here at Jacinga, which is a key strategic position, was given up, and giving up Jacinga meant that a lot of these south lateral roads were no longer accessible. So, because the Dutch had kind of retreated so rapidly without trying to hold up the Japanese, Blackburn figured that they would be at Lewiliang the next day. So he and Sitwell agreed that Black Force would move out at dawn the next morning, travelling west, crossing the steel bridge at Lewiliang, and uh, and a portion of their force would turn north at some point along the South Road to attack the Japanese on the North Road at the rear. So some of his units were going to cross the river and hold the centre of the Japanese advance. Others would work to the south of the road and attack the Japanese right flank and rear um, down here. And the Dutch would cross the river further north and attack the Japanese left flank and rear. And having done all that, they'd then move up to the North Road. However, this plan unravelled pretty much at birth also, because the Japanese, in addition to landing at the northwest, had also landed in the centre and were advancing on Bandung. So the Dutch army was pulled out to defend Bandung. General Schilling told Blackburn that for the defence of Lewiliang, he was pretty much on his own, and to move his forces up from Champier to Lewiliang to take the positions vacated by the Dutch troops. Another problem for Blackburn was lack of intelligence on where the enemy were, and in fact where the Dutch troops were. Blackburn's intelligence officer, a guy called Summons, asked his Dutch counterpart, could he give him an appreciation of where the Japanese troops were? And the Dutch intelligence officer said, I can't help you, the morning papers haven't arrived yet. And so somebody else told Summons, the intelligence officer, that there weren't any Japanese within 100 miles, so don't worry. The result of this was that the Allies weren't aware of the Japanese landings for some time. With the Australians having in the process of replacing the Dutch positions at Lewiliang, Blackburn ordered Williams, the Pioneer Battalion commander, to take an advance party of pioneers to the bridge area. As they approached the bridge, it blew up. The Dutch had blown the bridge up. They didn't know that Australians were going to relieve them, and they felt that they were being pulled back as part of their sort of rapid pullback to Bandung strategy. Blackburn was angry. This meant that the Black Force, not having the capacity to cross the river at Lewiliang, that they were now virtually immobile. So, the battle. I'll just read out a little piece. The Battle of Lewiliang and its aftermath was an epic. It is a tale of heroism, courage, perseverance, overcoming of adversity, and great leadership. It was not properly recognised at the time beyond Blackburn, who praised the sheer courage and fighting ability of the men under my command, and it is now all but forgotten. There have been many longer and bigger battles that result in victory, and battles that were more decisive and poignant, but no conflict would have seen more bravery, fortitude, and resilience displayed. The makeshift force of less than 3,000 men, over half of them frontline troops, the rest drivers, cooks, overage guards, other non-combatants, untried reinforcements of questionable provenance, and stragglers from Singapore of uncertain commitment, came under attack from, although they did not know it, an entire Japanese division. 20,000 men, infantry, tanks, engineers, and artillery. The Australian force is vastly inferior in equipment too. No air cover, only 3 mortars, only 600 grenades, a squadron of obsolete light tanks, and a depleted battalion of artillery. And many other hardships and setbacks were to arise along the way to be dealt with and overcome. So the Japanese had in fact landed on the 28th of February. Two large forces landed, one in the northwest, as I've said, and one in central Java. The northwest one, which is relevant to this tale, constituted 56 transports, including including an entire division. They moved inland with speed, helped not only by the lack of fortitude of the Dutch, but locals. The Western force split into two, one heading to Batavia along the north coast, along the Northern Coast Road, and the other on the southern road to Luiliang and Buitenzorg. The excuse me, the countryside on each side at Luiliang was a mix of jungle and flat open land and paddy fields with many small kampongs. And I'll just show you some pictures taken at the time of the terrain. This is all in the vicinity of Luiliang and Champier and Jacinga, and that's the road from Buitenzorg to Bandung, the main road. So, with the Dutch in the process of withdrawing, Blackburn repositioned his forces east of the Tianjin River. You see the Tianjin River kind of trickling down there. Two companies of the Pioneer Battalion were placed in the centre in the positions near the bridge and the river. Two companies of the Machine Gun Battalion were placed to the left rear to tackle enemy flanking units to the south. The tanks were sent to the north to cover the right flank. Remaining companies were placed in reserve at different distances to be a mobile reserve ready to move out to either flank at a moment's notice. And these reserve companies were placed all the way back to Champier, about a mile away. So the battle began. On the 2nd of March, Blackburn was reading a Dutch report which said that there were no Japanese landings on Java. As he was reading this report, on the other side of the river, he saw 5 enemy tanks coming into view, and then some cars, some other vehicles. They'd travelled, since landing on the 28th of February, they'd travelled 150 miles in short time, unimpeded. And then some infantry appeared, and then some heavier vehicles. He sent Colonel Williams out with Pioneer Battalion patrols to go north and south to check for flanking attacks. Colonel Williams was of the view that this was a major build-up that required a response. So they opened fire on the Japanese, and the battle had started. They scored direct hits on the officers' cars, excuse me, and other vehicles on the riverbank, and through the entirety of that first day, the 2nd of March, excuse me, the battle ensued, and fire was returned with fire, and one company of the Pioneer Battalion right on the bridge was suffered a lot of casualties, but they survived the first day. On the second day, the 3rd of March, I'll quickly run through the battle, but the Japanese had worked out the Allied positions pretty much, and the intensity of bombardment and the accuracy of fire improved. Blackburn called in the Texan artillery. He figured that they only had one chance at this, and they opened fire on the Japanese positions very successfully. It caused a wall of fire on the other side of the bank, and many Japanese troops were caught between the flames and the river, and the artillery continued to rain fire down on them, as did the troops at the centre, and the Japanese suffered a lot of casualties. Later in the afternoon, they could hear a lot of banging and hammering. They assumed that the enemy were building barges to cross the river, and they were right. Blackburn ordered his central force to pull back from the bridge to encourage the Japanese to cross, which they did. Um, but their flanking forces to the left and right were still in place on the river. And as the barges started to cross, they were fired on. Many were sunk, the others returned to shore. Unfortunately, they didn't suffer as many casualties as Blackburn was hoping. At night on the third, they could see flickering lights and hear the sound of engines moving south. Blackburn concluded that the Japanese had given up on a frontal assault and were now going to try and outflank them on their left. He sent two more companies down to the left to be ready to engage the Japanese at dawn. On the morning of the 4th, we're now into the third day of the battle. Schilling ordered Blackburn to come to Batavia to meet with him at a critical stage of the battle. Anyway, Schilling told Blackburn that Bandung was now under great threat from the central Japanese force, and he was pulling out. He was vacating West Java completely, and he wanted Blackburn to stay and prevent the Japanese from crossing the river for a further 24 hours to give the Dutch a chance to withdraw back to Bandung. Blackburn realised that this meant that he would have to pull back as well, because without any Dutch forces at all in West Java, his force was just too small and would get overwhelmed in the end. So he ordered for his troops to, apart from a rear guard, to cease fire at 6:30 that night, and to be prepared to move out at 9 p.m. to move to Sukabumi, which is just there below Buitenzorg. So at the start of that day, on the 4th, the Japanese had sent out a number of patrols to the south to try and outflank Blackburn's forces down this way. The machine gun battalions were under a lot of strain, and his flanking forces were getting pulled so much further south because the Japanese kept on going further and further south to try and outflank them, that in reality Blackburn realised that his front was being extended to a point that was untenable. His last move was to send a company of the Pioneer Battalion down south to reinforce the two machine gun battalions. A company went missing, and that's another story covered in the book. But at nightfall, he started pulling his troops back. It was probably the biggest challenge of the 3 days. Fortunately, a monsoonal storm arrived, which was acted as ideal cover for the men to get back. At around the time of the withdrawal, Blackburn received a report that there was a heavy build-up of Japanese forces on the other side of the river in the central position, just at the other end of the bridge. And he concluded that they were planning for another major central assault. And so he ordered the rear guard to open fire with everything they had at 11:15 p.m. to make the Japanese think that, in fact, they were going to cross the river. And the retreat was successful. The rear guard caught up with Blackburn's forces at Sukabumi. A company went missing. The full story of what happened to them wouldn't be known until after the war. And in the interest of time, I'll move on. But that's essentially the story of the Battle of Luoyang. It's an incredible story of a hodgepodge group of men, I would say brilliantly led by Brigadier Blackburn, against extraordinary odds. The Japanese would not believe that they had been held up by such a small force for so long. And this is a couple of Pioneer Battalion officers at the Champier station. And this is Captain Guild on the left, who is the commanding officer of A Company of the Pioneer Battalion, a 25-year-old Melbourne architect who disappeared with the company, with A Company. I'd now like to just talk about my second topic, leadership, and the man who led the Pioneer Battalion at this time. The first commander of the Pioneer Battalion was somebody who I can only describe as being ambitious and an attention seeker. And there are plenty of examples of that in the first book, Under the Same Moon, to justify that conclusion. I'll just give you one, which is the first time that the Pioneer Battalion saw action, which is the attack on Fort Merjayoun in Lebanon in 1941, and this is the fort. It had been decided to charge the fort to open the battle. It had been taken by the Allies a few weeks earlier and retaken by the Vichy French. It was heavily defended, 10-foot thick walls, two levels, and heavily defended in terms of weaponry and armour as well. The commander of the Pioneer Battalion was keen for his men to lead the charge. He wanted to show what his battalion were capable of, and the brigadier leading the operation eventually agreed to the Pioneer Battalion leading the charge on the fort. As you can see, it's pretty much flat open ground. No one told them that there was there's barbed wire fencing along the way. The pioneers, with their rifles and light machine guns, charged the fort. The leading company, in particular, was decimated. They had to sort of halt the advance, pull back. The fort was eventually taken about 2 or 3 days later, really because of sustained heavy artillery bombardment rather than any further crude World War I style infantry charges over open ground. The battalion commander had a slight wound and was in the Army General Hospital in Palestine, and he wrote a letter to one of his officers back in Victoria who had been a member of the Victorian Parliament. The letter is sort of full of gung-hoism and hyperbole. He opened up by saying that the Pioneer Battalion was now regarded as the crack unit, excuse me, the crack unit in the AIF. And sure, we suffered some losses on the charge on the fort, but you can't make an omelette without cracking a few eggs. The next permanent commander of the Pioneer Battalion was of a rather different kind. His name was Lieutenant Colonel John Williams, and this appeared in the Combined Battalion newsletter back in 2005, and I'll just read the first paragraph. In that terrible turmoil created for them as a prisoner of war of the Japanese, some Australians felt that they had been let down by their officers, whom they considered did not support their interests adequately when dealing with the Japanese. So that when such men as Weary Dunlop and others like him did support them, they left an enduring, affectionate memory in post-war years. Such a man who came out of those POW camps with high honour was the commanding officer of the 2nd Pioneer Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel John Williams. Shortly after the Black Force troops retreated through Sukabumi to Bandung, the Dutch capitulated. It had been Blackburn's intention to fight on and take his troops into the southern mountains of Java, but it became clear that this was impractical and he'd be putting the health of his troops at risk considerably. So he realized that there was no choice but, because of the Dutch capitulation, to surrender, which, as we've heard, caused a lot of anger and upset amongst the troops. The the now prisoners, after uh, spending a few days in a couple of villages along the way, found themselves in old Dutch military quarters, back in Batavia, called the bicycle camp. This is one of the buildings in the bicycle camp. Shortly after they'd arrived there, the Japanese Gestapo, the Kempai Tai, turned up, rounded up a number of senior officers, including Williams, and took them off to their headquarters, where they were tortured and interrogated. About a month later, they returned, emaciated, bedraggled, beaten, um, unkempt, sporting very shaggy beards. A few days um, later, one of the other officers sat down with Cal and Alan and told them what had happened. And I'll just read this out. The colonel suffered the worst of them, said Ron. They had all sorts of questions about the forces on Java, the defences in Australia, the types of roads in Australia and their condition, how the military forces were organised, and many other things. When he refused to answer their questions, they put him in a small cell with 16 native prisoners. There wasn't enough room to lie down, and he had no mosquito net. He wasn't allowed to shave, and only very rarely could he wash. The food ration was generally a single plate of rice each day, sometimes with a fish head. However, at one point his ration was withdrawn, and he had nothing to eat for 5 days. Eventually he was given a bowl of rice, which he ate but threw up. A poison had been put in the rice to induce vomiting. He was regularly beaten and burnt with cigarette ends. He endured one of the Kempai Tai's favourite forms of torture, the water treatment. I won't go into that here. It's pretty gruesome, but it's in the book. One time he was blindfolded and taken out before a firing squad. He was told they would shoot unless he talked. He didn't talk, but instead of the expected volley of fire, the officer in charge praised him for his bravery, and he was taken back to his cell. He was strapped to a chair and bashed with any weapon available, wooden or metal, hour after hour, on and on, sometimes so relentlessly that he lost awareness of everything, day, night, time. They threw the chair, William strapped to it, around the room. They twisted his legs around. They burnt the Salisbury's feet with cigarette butts. Ron said he had suffered similar treatment. None of us said a thing, said Ron proudly. They stared at his bandaged hands, the slowly healing burns in his arms, hands, and face, and the bruises on his head. And I tell you, the colonel, he's a tough bugger, unbelievable what he went through. On the railway, Williams, so this is a picture taken of Williams on his secret camera sometime after their release, still with a beard on, but clean shaven. And I look at this picture, and I just see defiance. On the railway, he commanded one of two mobile groups at the Burma end. He consistently sought to protect his men. He complained ceaselessly about the rations, that they needed something better than rice and weevils. He objected to sick men being sent out to work, and he pleaded for medical supplies, any medical supplies. He was rarely successful at all, but he didn't let up. And so for a year on the railway and afterwards in other camps, he was relentless, and he annoyed the Japanese for doing this. They thought of him as disrespectful, as being unsoldierly. And one guard one day said to him, "Why can't you be like the commander of the other mobile unit? He doesn't complain. He just does what he's told. Why can't you be like him?" Well, he just kept at it. And towards the the end of the time on the railway, this anger erupted, and he was subjected to some awful torture and beatings. But he didn't give up. So he was clearly an outstanding Australian. In a letter after release back home, Cal said of Williams, "He is a very fine man, Jean, and probably the bravest I have ever known. The cruelties he has undergone for the men under his command are too numerous to mention. Many other senior officers were a complete washout." So, for all that he was mentioned in that article alongside Dunlop, and for all that he sought to do for his men and for what he endured over such a long period of time, he never received any official recognition. And today he's forgotten. The railway at the Burma end started on at Tan which is south of the port town of Moulmein. Moulmein. Both of these towns are in the Mon state in southern Burma. During the 1990s, the Mon state was subject to a lot of civil unrest and widespread violence, and it was impossible to get there. I'd always wanted to go there because I wanted to see the places in and around Moulmein and Tanbazayat that Cal wrote about in his memoirs. And I wanted to go to the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery to see where the graves of a number of his friends. Towards the turn of this century, things had eased up a bit in the Mon state, and it became possible to go there. And so I went. A friend of mine in Singapore introduced me to a person called Nanda, who arranged an itinerary around where I told her I wanted to go to. And she also arranged for the various visas and paperwork to get us through the multiple checkpoints there were on the road between Yangon and Tanbazayat. Nanda herself was quite interesting because her father had been in the inner circle of Aung San, the revolutionary leader of the 1940s, known as the father of modern Myanmar. So this is the Tanbazayat station, which I'm sure hadn't changed a bit. This is 25 years ago, but hadn't changed a bit from how it must have appeared in 1942. It was here that prisoners were offloaded after their journey from Moulmein and marched to the nearby prison camp to start their lives on the railway. There is a very small museum there, and we moved on to the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery, which I just thought was just vast and beautiful and quiet. And I found the graves of a number of Cal's friends. This man was brutally murdered, um, described in the book. This man was Cal's batman, and who was left for dead, literally, with 200 others in a cholera-infested camp because he was too weak to walk to the next camp. Through Nanda, as our interpreter, we spoke to a number of locals, and they all talked about hearing howls coming out of the jungle at night still, even in the early 2000s. Those howls were probably of, more likely than not, of Asian labourers rather than Allied prisoners, because there were many more Asian labourers who worked on the railway than there were Allied prisoners, and they suffered more and died in far greater numbers. The senior officer at the Burma end was Brigadier Varley, who was based at the Tanbazayat camp, but he made frequent visits along the line to check on the welfare of his men. And he also kept a secret diary. And this is what I say. Over just a few days, Varley visited all of the camps as far as the 108 kilo camp, meaning 108 kilometres from Tanbazayat. So much distressed him the plight of the local people as much as his soldiers. He wrote in his diary that he saw, quote, the pathetic sight of Burmese families moving back along the road with some members stricken with cholera. A lad of about 10 years, as thin as a stick, with a terrified expression being carried by his mother. A man of about 21 being helped along, each 20 or 30 yards collapsing and doubling up with griping pains. These poor devils don't appear to receive any treatment, and no wonder they die like flies. So finally, August 1945, war's end. Cal and Alan, his brother, along with many others, find themselves um, around or in Bangkok, and they're quartered in Bangkok for treatment and recovery. Cal and Alan spent quite a bit of time here at the rundown Oriental Hotel, which had been ransacked by the Japanese. There was no furniture in it, and it had been used for a while as an officers' club. Like all of them, Cal had had his share of afflictions. He'd almost died twice, once because of a beating, once because of a cocktail of malaria and dysentery. He'd had malaria over 50 times, dysentery a number of times, beriberi, tropical ulcers on his legs, pellagra, and perforated eardrums because of beatings. In the middle of September, about a month after war's end, Jean received this telegram notifying her that he was in fact alive and in Thailand. With next of kin notified, the ex-prisoners were told that it was now possible for them to write home. So 3.5 years after his last letter, Carl sat down with a pencil and a single sheet of paper and wrote, and this is his first letter. My dearest darling Jean, it seems almost a century since I wrote to you and told you how much I love you. I feel just like writing it over and over again till I fill both sides of this sheet. But I know that you know how much I think of you and that you have never been out of my thoughts, no matter what misery I have been undergoing. The only thing that has kept me sane has been thinking of you and what I could and am going to do for you when I get home. I'm not going to write about the war or our experiences. We have too much sadness and unhappiness. But I must tell you that unfortunately, C Company have lost heavily. Practically all our friends of Pucker days have gone. I have so much to say to you, I don't know what to tell you first. I suppose we are all a little cracked here, but not completely so. All the very batty ones are locked up. I don't think I'm the Prince of Wales or anything sweeter. Then in subsequent letters, he does start to open up a bit. And here he talks about men who won't come back. We started off from Moulmein with 32 officers and 880 men. In December 1942, I think we had about 200. A lot, of course, were in hospital camps. The difference between a hospital camp and an ordinary camp was that prisoners did not work, but of course, no work, no food. Working through the jungle, we came across a hospital from Allen's branch. They'd been left to die, and unfortunately they did. Just a handful of our chaps came out of it. We did what we could for them, but as we were the rail laying unit, we were moving always. When we were there, we buried about 6 each day. All the day, the bugle that was sounding the last post taps or the Dutch call. We also found Granny and Sheridan. Sheridan was my batman at Bonagilla, a bright little chap with such a nice wife and a little baby girl at Mildura. Jean, darling, I do feel so sorry for those poor people waiting for those men who will not return. We're going to visit as many of them as possible when we get home. I have the watch of a chap called Bob Dickinson who was married just before he left. He adored his wife. I hid the watch to get it home to her. Do please, darling, should you meet any of them, do tell them that their wives and sweethearts were always with them in spirit. They were glorious men, our Australians. No one at home can ever realise their suffering, sacrifice, and courage. No man was never neglected by his pals. They washed and fed them, carried them for miles, often with fatal results for themselves, as our hearts were bad. Then they're going home. Cal and Alan arrived at Kalang Aerodrome in Singapore on this C-47 from Bangkok. And in October, 2 months after war's end, they're on their way boarding the ship, the Highland Brigade. There's apprehension at both ends. Cal, he wonders if he's the same person. He's been diagnosed, like all of them, as suffering from anxiety. His memory's not what it used to be. The anxiety is manifesting itself in different ways. He's concerned that Jean will think that a whole bunch of problems is loaded on her doorstep. For Jean's part, she's horrified by the passion expressed in some of Cal's letters. She says, she implores him, don't look at me through rose-coloured glasses. I'm not beautiful, I never was. And you haven't seen me for 4 years, I'm different. So a lot of apprehension going both sides as they sail home from Sydney via Fremantle to Sydney to Melbourne. Cal was woken by a flash of dawn light on the porthole glass. He sat up and looked out. There was land and a small town on the beach. He knew it. It was one of their familiar favourite places, and they'd gone there for holidays. Tim was stirring, but the others were asleep. Boys, he shouted excitedly, look, it's Apollo Bay. I'm sure of it. They jumped out of their bunks and climbed onto Cal's, taking it in turn by twos to look out. The coastline bathed in the luminescent lights of a brilliant sunrise. What a sight! And look, shouted Alan, coming up, that has to be Lorne. Come on. They dressed hurriedly. They'd packed their bags the night before to be ready to disembark, to be able to spend the morning on deck, soaking up the familiar landscape and landmarks and the exhilaration of their homecoming. Shortly after, they found a position on the rails as the ship changed course and moved towards the Heads and Port Phillip Bay. Thank you. Thanks, Brent. You're on mute. You're on mute, Brent.
Oh, in the meantime, Peter, I say that's something incredibly powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Right, that's what
Oh,
I
there you
need.
go. Thanks, Graham.
Now, Peter, could you turn off the
Oh, yeah, sorry.
the presentation, please?
Yep.
Now, I've lost my my little note. This is a sorry about that, folks. How do we get this? Oh,
What are you
Jason, it's taking up full size, and I can't get my.
I just have to.
I can't make the screen smaller.
Is there anything in the top right-hand corner?
Yeah, but it
Not going to let you reduce the size?
except full screen.
We,
Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that. Thank you, Peter. Thanks very much for the presentation. I'd now like to see if there's any questions from the audience. Anyone?
So I'm sorry for the state of my voice. I have been getting over a cold, and it's been fine today. But as soon as I started talking, it collapsed.
So, does anyone have any questions for Peter? Tracy.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Peter, at the start of the presentation, you mentioned about having the letters and the diaries, etc. And I wondered how you went about um, putting the diaries and the letters, interposing that with the actual stories within the battles. Did you have the letters all separate, or did you have them intersposed with it as it went along? And did you have many letters? Well, I'd be surprised if you did have any letters from when they were on the railway.
Yeah. So absolutely no letters in the railway,
Oh,
Tracy. In fact, I was wondering whether to talk about that tonight, but I felt there was too much content already. But one of the other things about this story is that there was effectively no communication for 3.5 years. Um, Cal didn't receive a letter from Jean, with one exception, until between the last letter he received was December 1941, when he was still in the Middle East. One batch of letters did get through while they were on the railway, but that was it. And they weren't allowed to write letters. All they were given were 3 or 4 letter cards over the duration over the 3.5 years, which were like multiple choice questions. I'm sick, I'm not sick, and I'm well, I'm not well, and that was it. So so I yes, so to answer your question, I started off this journey really in just reading all of the letters and all of the memoirs, and then going into the historical backdrop more. So I spent a lot of time reading and just working out in my mind how to structure the story, and where to place the letters and the personal accounts, and including the battalion history. I would say I would regard it as a personal part of the personal narrative, and how to place that with the historical backdrop. So it was it took quite a bit of planning, and the letters are used more sparingly in this volume than in the first one, partly because there are fewer of them, but partly also because um, there's I didn't want too many letters to get in the way of the narrative of the railway. And I think that the letters come into their own in relation to the recovery period, when there's, without going into another part of the story, but there's so much increasing bitterness as to the way they feel they're being treated. That comes out in the letters. I hope that answers your question.
Graham.
Peter, generally speaking, we only see the letters that the men have written home, because the men didn't keep the letters that were written to them.
Yeah.
Is this the case with what you've found as well?
No, Graham, I've got every letter that Jean wrote to Cal, and I can't believe this, but with one exception, the first one she wrote after she was told that he was still alive. And but having looked into their correspondence, I've finally concluded, after like almost years of trying to track it down, that it never reached him, because he talks about how he didn't receive one letter. But apart from that one, I've got all of her letters as well, and all of his father's letters.
So he kept them all.
Yep,
Yep.
yep. So what happened was, she kept on writing. She didn't know he left the Middle East. She kept on writing over there. Those letters were returned to her eventually. Then, when they were told that they were prisoners in Java, they were told to write again through the Red Cross. And she wrote stacks, but the Japanese chose not to distribute them. And so they just accumulated in Red Cross bags at the camps. And they finally got them after release.
Yep. Yep. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Peter. In the next couple of days, we'll send information about Peter's book, and there's just one last little page to go, and you can have the night off. Oh no. On Wednesday, the 19th of August, 2026, our next speaker will be Nigel Alsop. Nigel has worked with military and the police dogs for over 3 decades, both in Australia and internationally. He'll be talking about his new book, Dogs of War, Guardians of the Battlefield, True Stories of Loyalty and Bravery. These are the stories we rarely hear, the ones that stay with soldiers long after the war is over. And this brings this evening's session to a close. Thanks very much, Peter. Thanks also for Jason, who keeps this going behind the scenes, and thank you for joining us. We hope you come again. Good
Thanks,
night.
Brent. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Peter, it's great.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.